The galaxy had long known only one authority, a sprawling dominion that called itself the Galactic Empire. For millennia it had grown fat on tribute, subjugation, and fear, ruling countless species with an iron mandate that brooked no dissent. Its fleets stretched across spiral arms, its banners hung over the skylines of 1,000 worlds, and its voice was the final word in any dispute. For the conquered, resistance was unthinkable. For the uncontacted, submission was inevitable. When the Empire spoke, entire civilizations bent their knees. Until humanity. The broadcast arrived without ceremony, a signal pushed into every human system, translated into every language. A holographic projection of a high imperial voice addressed the Terran people with the cold certainty of a master dictating to slaves not yet shackled. The message was simple, unadorned, dripping with condescension. Humanity was to disarm immediately, dismantle its fleets, surrender its colonies, and submit to imperial stewardship. In exchange, the species would be granted survival, though not autonomy. Refusal, the envoy declared, would bring annihilation. The ultimatum concluded with a line delivered not as a threat but as a certainty. "You will not resist us. None ever have." Across Earth and the colonies, reactions rippled like shockwaves. Some stared in silence at the projection, struck numb by the audacity of it. Others laughed bitterly, as though the arrogance of the message could only be met with derision. But the prevailing response, spreading faster than any signal, was anger. It was one thing to know humanity was young by galactic standards, a minor species compared to those who had charted the stars for millennia. It was another to be told that their choices, their sovereignty, and their future were already forfeit. That fury united miner and politician, soldier and farmer alike, in a way no threat from within ever had. The Empire expected panic, capitulation, perhaps desperate negotiations begging for leniency. What it encountered was silence, a silence that spoke louder than any plea could have. The Terran Council convened, leaders from Earth and every settled colony meeting through secure channels. They did not argue over whether to comply. The question was only how humanity should answer. History weighed heavily on the chamber. Humanity's past was littered with empires that had risen and fallen, nations that had sought to dominate others only to crumble under their own arrogance. No people knew better than humans what it meant to resist occupation, to pay for freedom in blood and perseverance. The Empire's message carried with it the casual dismissal of a farmer addressing livestock. It had not occurred to them that humanity might already have been preparing for this eventuality. Over the last century, while humanity expanded across nearby stars, it also remembered the lessons of its own turbulent past. It built defenses not simply to ward off pirates or rival colonies, but with the unspoken recognition that someday a greater power might arrive to demand obedience. Research projects were disguised as civilian, logistics networks hidden beneath commercial traffic, and fleets trained to think like hunters rather than parade soldiers. Humanity did not prepare to be the largest force in the galaxy. It prepared to be the one that would never surrender. Ordinary citizens understood this truth instinctively. When the ultimatum ended, messages flooded across networks and colonies, not calls to surrender, but calls to stand together. The defiance was not born of arrogance. Humanity knew well enough that the Empire's fleets dwarfed their own, its armies outnumbered them 100-fold. The defiance was born of something older, something etched into the marrow of their species: survival against impossible odds. Every human carried the legacy of ancestors who had endured famines, plagues, wars, and disasters. No other species in the Empire could claim to have risen from a single fragile world, clawing their way forward despite endless adversity. The ultimatum was meant to break their spirit. Instead, it reminded them of who they were. For the first time in generations, humanity felt no division. Old rivalries and disputes between Earth and its colonies dissolved overnight. Corporations set aside profit margins, governments laid down grudges, and citizens volunteered in numbers so vast that infrastructure strained to absorb them. The Empire believed it had presented humanity with a binary choice: surrender or die. Humanity saw a third option: resist, fight, endure, and win, no matter the cost. The Empire had intended its ultimatum to be the opening of a swift conquest, the crushing of yet another primitive race under its heel. What it had delivered was a spark. A declaration to humanity that survival could only be secured through defiance. And in the silence that followed, in the gathering storm of preparation, the truth crystallized. The Empire had made a mistake. They had mistaken patience for weakness, caution for fear, and humanity's humility for submission. That miscalculation would soon echo across the stars. The Terran Council's chamber pulsed with the weight of history. Leaders from Earth, Mars, Titan, and the scattered colonies were joined through secure quantum relays. The ultimatum had left no ambiguity, and yet the debate was not over whether to resist. That decision had been made the moment the Empire dared speak, as if humanity's fate had already been sealed. The discussion centered instead on how to answer in a way that would resonate across every star where a human flag still flew. The reply would not be whispered in negotiation rooms, nor confined to classified channels. It would be broadcast openly, defiantly, and permanently etched into the records of galactic memory. A statement, not to persuade the Empire, they were beyond persuasion, but to tell every human, every ally, and every neutral observer that submission was not in humanity's nature. What followed would become legend, a declaration not just of war, but of identity. The Terran Chancellor spoke with measured words, her voice steady despite the knowledge of the war she was igniting. Humanity, she declared, was born free and would remain so. No empire, no matter how ancient or vast, had the right to dictate the destiny of a species. The Empire threatened annihilation, but humans had always lived under that shadow, from extinction events, from global wars, from the vacuum of space itself. "We are still here," she proclaimed, "because we do not yield." That phrase, simple and unadorned, ignited hearts across worlds. Within hours, it became the rallying cry of the Terran people. The Empire had assumed that by demonstrating overwhelming superiority, it would cow humanity into pragmatic compliance. What it had overlooked was that humans did not measure worth by survival alone. To kneel was worse than to perish, and to fight was to live with dignity, even if death followed. That perspective, alien to species long conditioned under imperial dominance, was humanity's strength. They would not be remembered as obedient subjects. They would be remembered as the ones who chose defiance, regardless of the odds. Strategists within the Terran fleet outlined their course. Humanity could not hope to mirror the Empire's vast armadas, but they could outthink them. Guerrilla warfare would replace fleet engagements. Ambushes in asteroid belts, feigned retreats into gravity wells, and precision strikes against supply convoys would erode the Empire's momentum. The very vastness of space, once considered humanity's vulnerability, would become a weapon. Small fleets could vanish into nebulae, reappear behind enemy lines, and vanish again before reprisals could strike. Where the Empire wielded brute force, humanity relied on creativity. Engineers reconfigured mining lasers into ship-borne weapons. Civilian freighters were refitted overnight into raiding craft. Colonists on fringe worlds devised traps using nothing more than local resources and ingenuity. The collective resourcefulness of billions was mobilized, each individual convinced their contribution mattered. Unlike the rigid imperial machine, humanity thrived on improvisation, and it was that adaptability that the Empire could neither predict nor counter. More than tactics, however, it was spirit that defined humanity's answer. Across the colonies, people rallied around the declaration. Musicians composed songs that carried the refrain, "We are still here." Artists painted banners, soldiers wore insignias etched with symbols of defiance. In a matter of weeks, what had been isolated star systems linked by fragile unity transformed into a civilization of one voice. Fear had not divided them, it had fused them into steel. The first clashes soon followed. Imperial patrols that entered human space expecting token resistance found themselves harried by small, agile ships striking with surgical precision before slipping into darkness. Human commanders understood they could not afford large-scale battles yet, but they could bleed the Empire, forcing it to expend resources and morale against an enemy that refused to break. Each successful strike, no matter how small, was broadcast back to human space, a reminder that the fight was not hopeless, that the Terran Empire, born of necessity, was capable of standing toe-to-toe with giants. For the aliens within the Galactic Empire who witnessed this defiance, the effect was unsettling. They had seen countless species submit, beaten before the first shot was fired. To see a young race not only refuse but strike back was something altogether new. Humanity was not simply resisting, it was changing the narrative. The Empire's ultimatum had been designed to end the conversation before it began. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a declaration of independence that could not be silenced. What the Empire failed to understand, and what humanity now embraced fully, was that war was not about numbers alone. It was about will, about endurance, about the refusal to allow another to define one's future. The Terran Empire had been born not from conquest but from the decision that slavery was unacceptable. Every ship launched, every battle fought, every life risked carried that truth into the void. The Empire had demanded submission. Humanity's answer was simple, absolute, and irrevocable: no. The Empire answered defiance with fury. Where ultimatums had failed, terror would succeed, at least that was their doctrine. Within weeks, colossal fleets crossed into human territory, vast formations of warships that blotted out stars when their armadas assembled. These were not patrols or exploratory task forces. These were weapons of annihilation, deployed to crush a lesson into the memory of a young species. Entire systems were placed under siege. The Empire's admirals believed the war would end within months. The first blows were devastating. Colonies on the frontier, proud outposts of humanity, were reduced to ash under planetary bombardment. Cities that had taken decades to build were leveled in hours. Billions died before resistance could even mobilize. To the Empire, this was business as usual, a display of overwhelming might, the kind that had broken countless civilizations in the past. They assumed humanity would fragment under such horror, that fear would eclipse resolve. Instead, the massacres hardened resolve. For every world destroyed, 10 more swore vengeance. Images of burning colonies spread across human networks, not as warnings to submit but as calls to action. The grief was immense, but it crystallized into rage. Families volunteered en masse, fleets swelled with recruits, industries converted overnight to armament production. The Empire had miscalculated. They had confused cruelty with victory, and in doing so, had welded humanity together in a unity stronger than any treaty. Human tactics adapted rapidly. Conventional battles against imperial armadas remained impossible, but humans refused to present themselves as easy targets. Fleets dispersed, slipping into hidden routes and unpredictable trajectories. Small strike groups targeted fuel depots, logistics lines, and communications relays. They turned the Empire's greatest advantage, its sprawling size, into a liability. Every convoy destroyed, every supply line severed, forced the Empire to divert more resources simply to sustain its war machine. The Empire grew frustrated. Their fleets were designed for dominance, not pursuit of elusive enemies. Massive warships bristling with weapons found themselves ambushed by smaller vessels darting in and out of range, striking weak points before fleeing into asteroid fields or nebulae. Human commanders learned to weaponize terrain and chaos, drawing the Empire into traps where numbers meant less than initiative. The cold efficiency of imperial doctrine could not adapt to such fluidity. For every imperial victory, there was a cost higher than anticipated. Even when colonies fell, the defenders extracted a toll. Cities wired with explosives denied the Empire occupation. Ground troops expecting submission faced guerrilla warfare in streets and tunnels. Civilians refused to bow, choosing to fight with scavenged weapons rather than kneel to foreign soldiers. Humanity's refusal to surrender even in defeat baffled the invaders, who had conquered countless worlds where resistance collapsed once the first defenses were breached. Here, the opposite occurred. Every loss produced fighters more determined than before. Stories of human defiance spread quickly beyond their borders. Alien species long bent under the Empire's yoke listened secretly to intercepted transmissions. They heard the voices of human leaders promising never to yield, the reports of civilians standing against armored divisions, the records of fleets too small to win yet too stubborn to be annihilated. For those who had lived in submission for generations, it was an awakening. If humanity could resist, perhaps others could as well. The spark of rebellion flickered in places the Empire had thought permanently subdued. The Imperial High Council, alarmed, ordered larger deployments. But size only slowed them further. Fleets stretched thin, burdened by supply shortages, became easier targets. The more force the Empire committed, the more vulnerable it became to disruption. Humanity had no illusions of immediate triumph, but it did not need triumph now. It needed endurance. Every skirmish survived was proof the Empire was not infallible, and every life sacrificed carried weight that resonated across the stars. The Empire had entered the war believing it would be swift, decisive, and unquestioned. Instead, they found themselves mired in a conflict that consumed resources and strained credibility. To admit the war dragged on was to admit weakness, and weakness was poison to their rule. Yet the truth grew impossible to ignore. Humanity, a race dismissed as inconsequential, had drawn the mighty Empire into a struggle it could neither end quickly nor contain easily. By the end of the first campaign, the galaxy no longer saw humanity as a fragile newcomer. It saw them as a species that endured devastation without surrender, a people who turned tragedy into defiance, and whose very survival challenged the foundations of imperial dominance. The Empire still held overwhelming strength, but it had already lost what it valued most, the illusion of inevitability. Humanity's endurance did more than frustrate the Empire, it bought time. Time for scientists, engineers, and tacticians to turn desperation into innovation. From hidden facilities buried deep within asteroid belts and moons, breakthroughs emerged at a pace the Empire could neither predict nor match. Cybernetic warfare systems capable of infiltrating Imperial communications disrupted fleet coordination. Experimental rail cannons and plasma lances, once theoretical projects, were deployed aboard strike craft. Old freighters were transformed into carriers for swarms of drones, overwhelming enemy defenses through sheer unpredictability. Humanity lacked numbers, but it wielded imagination like a blade. The Empire's fleets, built on doctrine perfected over centuries, relied on precision and order. Humanity dismantled that order piece by piece. False signals lured Imperial patrols into ambushes. Hacked navigation systems redirected convoys into asteroid fields. In one infamous engagement, an entire Imperial armada collapsed into chaos when its targeting systems were corrupted, forcing ships to fire on each other before human raiders struck. The Empire's commanders had never faced an adversary so willing to bend rules, exploit errors, and weaponize unpredictability. Yet it was not technology alone that shifted momentum. It was humanity's ability to inspire. Every act of defiance was broadcast across subspace, not only to human systems, but deliberately into channels the Empire could not fully silence. These transmissions became rallying cries, not propaganda but raw accounts of survival and defiance. Footage of battered fleets emerging victorious against impossible odds spread like wildfire. On worlds enslaved for generations, whispers grew into conversations, and conversations into planning. Rebellions simmered. Other species, long thought broken, began to test the strength of their chains. Small uprisings disrupted Imperial supply routes. Insurgents sabotaged garrisons and whispered human slogans in their streets. The Empire's iron grip weakened, not because humanity had destroyed it, but because it had exposed its vulnerability. If a young race from a single star could resist, why couldn't others? What had once been considered unthinkable became plausible, and possibility is the seed from which revolutions grow. For humanity, the decisive moment came when the Terran fleet launched a daring strike on an Imperial shipyard orbiting a gas giant. This was no isolated raid, it was a calculated attack on one of the Empire's arteries. Shipyards were the backbone of Imperial power, symbols of endless production and dominance. The assault required coordination on a scale humanity had never attempted before, combining fleets from multiple colonies, cyber units flooding comms, and ground teams sabotaging defenses from within. When the shipyard fell, it was more than a tactical victory, it was proof that the Empire could bleed. The cost was enormous. Thousands of lives were lost, entire fleets shattered, and colonies stripped bare to fuel the effort. Yet the sacrifice resonated across human space as a triumph worth every drop of blood. The Empire had been forced to acknowledge what it had never admitted before: humanity could not be dismissed as a nuisance. They were an enemy capable of striking at the heart of imperial power. In response, the Empire escalated once more, but with each escalation came diminishing returns. Vast deployments left other regions undefended. Every new offensive stretched supply chains further, offering more opportunities for raids. Human strategists understood they could not win outright through brute force, but they could choke the Empire with attrition. The war shifted from survival to contest of endurance, and endurance was where humanity thrived. The psychological tide had turned. Where once humans feared annihilation, now they fought with conviction that survival was achievable. The question was no longer whether humanity could endure. It was how much the Empire was willing to pay for their submission. That shift in perception was devastating to imperial authority. Armies function best when enemies fear them. Without fear, their victories became hollow. Humanity had stripped away that fear and replaced it with defiance. By the end of this phase of the war, humanity had not only defended its sovereignty but had positioned itself as the center of something larger than survival. It had become a symbol. The Terran Empire was no longer merely resisting occupation, it was rewriting the galactic narrative. The Empire's dominance was no longer absolute, its authority no longer unquestioned. And though humanity remained bloodied and scarred, its determination burned hotter than ever. The Empire had entered the war with arrogance, expecting a swift campaign that would extinguish resistance before it ever took root. Years later, that arrogance had rotted into desperation. What was once a proud display of superiority had become a grinding war of attrition, draining fleets, exhausting treasuries, and undermining confidence across the galaxy. The Terran Empire, born in fire and sustained by defiance, had proven too costly to break. Every ship destroyed was replaced, every city leveled rebuilt in spirit if not in stone, and every casualty only deepened the resolve of those who remained. Humanity had not only survived the storm, it had weathered it so fiercely that the storm itself began to falter. Imperial leaders faced a truth they could not ignore. Their fleets were still vast, their armies still countless, but the war no longer served its purpose. An empire that thrived on fear could not afford to appear weak, and yet every day of stalemate broadcast weakness across the stars. Their enemies had learned to resist. Their subjects had learned to dream. The longer the conflict continued, the more cracks appeared in their dominion. To persist would risk the very foundation of their rule. Reluctantly, and without the triumph they had once expected, the empire sought an end. For humanity, the decision was not victory in the traditional sense. No grand parade marked the conclusion, no singular battle brought about final collapse. Instead, the empire extended overtures, not of dominance but of negotiation. That act alone was historic. A power that had demanded unconditional surrender was now forced to acknowledge humanity as an equal. When the terms were presented, humanity's answer was measured, not vengeful. They had not fought for conquest. They had fought for freedom, and their demands reflected that. Independence was non-negotiable, sovereignty absolute, and every system touched by human blood remained forever beyond imperial chains. The empire agreed, for it had no other choice. The war's conclusion reverberated across the galaxy. Species long cowed by imperial might now saw that the giant could bleed, and once bled, it could bargain. The psychological shift was irreversible. Insurrections ignited in territories thought pacified for generations. Worlds that had bowed for centuries began to whisper defiance, emboldened by the precedent humanity had set. The myth of inevitability, the foundation of imperial rule, had been shattered. And it was humanity that had wielded the hammer. The cost, however, was immense. Entire colonies were gone, reduced to ashes that would never know rebirth. Fleets lay in ruins, names etched into memorials instead of musters. Families were broken, and scars ran across every surviving world. Yet in those scars lay pride, because each wound was proof that they had endured what no other species dared attempt. The Terran Empire emerged battered but unbroken, forged into something harder than steel, a civilization that had tested the limits of its endurance, and found those limits non-existent. For the first time, humanity spoke to the galaxy not as supplicants or upstarts, but as equals. Their leaders made it clear, humanity had no desire to replace one tyranny with another. They sought no empire of slaves, no dominion carved from ashes. They asked only for the right to stand, unbent, alongside others. But the example they set carried consequences far beyond their intent. Every oppressed species now looked to humanity as the standard, the embodiment of refusal, the living argument that subjugation was not inevitable. The empire, though still vast, would never recover its aura of invincibility. And humanity, though still small compared to the powers around it, had earned something no fleet could enforce: respect. The galaxy would never forget the war, not because of the ships destroyed or the worlds burned, but because of the lesson it taught. Strength was not measured in size or age. It was measured in the will to say no, to fight when surrender seemed rational, and to endure when destruction seemed certain. Humanity had been underestimated, dismissed, and threatened with extinction. In answering that threat, they had done more than preserve their existence. They had changed the course of galactic history. The ultimatum that was meant to chain them instead forged them into a symbol of freedom. And in the silence after the war, as the stars turned once more in their endless dance, one truth stood clear: humanity's greatest weapon had never been technology or numbers. It was the unyielding conviction that they would never bow.